Alan Jackson was once the voice that made America believe country music was born to tell honest, decent stories. On stage, Alan Jackson was the man who had an entire nation singing along to songs that became part of America's collective memory. Chattahoochee, Remember When, and Where Were You? For decades, Alan Jackson stood at the very top. Platinum records, sold-out tours, a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and a family that seemed, from the outside, perfectly complete. But then, everything began to collapse in the quietest way possible, starting from within his own body. A rare neurological disease slowly robbed him of his ability to move. Hands that once held a guitar with confidence now tremble. Feet that once walked the stage with ease must now calculate every single step. At the same time, long-standing fractures in his marriage quietly drained not only his spirit, but his finances as well. The cruelest part is not the illness itself, but the fact that he remains fully conscious, fully aware of himself slowly losing the person he used to be. So, at the age of 67, what losses has Alan Jackson been forced to endure? Before we begin, if Alan Jackson's music was ever there for you at any moment in your life, please leave a like as a quiet tribute to him. There are people who, when they step onto a brightly lit stage, make us believe they were born already carrying America's spotlight. But the truth is far more unforgiving. Many legends began their lives in the harshest circumstances imaginable. Alan Jackson was born on the 17th of October, 1958, in Newnan, Georgia. He grew up cramped inside an old garage that had been converted into a tiny shack, where the smell of dampness and the sound of wind whistling through wooden cracks became painfully familiar. Alan's father, Gene, known to everyone as Daddy Gene, worked as a mechanic at the Ford Motor Company. He was a man of very few words, but his rough, oil-stained hands spoke volumes about a lifetime of labor. Whenever he placed a hand on his son's shoulder, he left behind just 4 short words: "Keep trying, son." Not meant as encouragement, but as a way of passing down Alan's very first lesson in resilience, that true strength is not found in words, but in the ability to stand firm when no one is left to support you. Alan's mother, Ruth, worked in a school cafeteria. Her hands were cracked and worn from chopping vegetables all week long, yet they were the warmest hands in that broken home. She was not rich in material things, but she was rich in love. She was the one who mended every fracture in the family, with faith, with gentleness, and with Southern songs she sang softly while holding her child each night. She often told Alan a sentence that later sounded almost prophetic: "Music is the greatest thing in this world." But love alone could not warm that house through the bitter winters. There were nights when Alan curled up inside an old coat, shivering as if the cold were gnawing away at each breath he took. The food cupboard was almost always empty. Many days there was only a piece of stale bread, a few spoiled potatoes, or worse, a cold, silent plate of flour, lying there like a truth no one wanted to name. And in those years of absolute deprivation, Alan learned a costly lesson. When material things offer nothing to hold on to, the only things that keep a person standing are love and self-respect. Like so many poor children in the American South, Alan entered the workforce at an age far too young to understand what tired even meant. At 12 years old, while other kids were still playing ball outside, he quietly walked into a lumber mill with hands that were still small and a shirt frayed at the cuffs. He hauled wood for hire, wiped grease in auto repair shops, and learned to endure in silence just like his father. On rainy days, his torn shoes caused him to slip on the floor, and falling timber crashed down onto his body, leaving behind deep bruises. And then, in that dim yellow light, thick with dust and the smell of machine oil, something like salvation appeared. Music. Alan sang along to a neighbor's old radio, and in those flickering, distorted sounds, he discovered for the first time what it felt like to escape his own life. Years later, looking back on that period, Alan spoke with the steady voice of someone who had tasted every kind of hardship. "We had nothing back then. If I wanted something, I had to sweat for it myself." There were no shortcuts. The first turning point came when Alan was 16 years old. His parents saved every dollar they could to buy their son a guitar worth $50. When the guitar was placed into his hands, Alan held it against his chest as if it were something sacred, more precious than anything material. Not because it was new, but because for the first time in his life, he felt that he had an escape. Alan played almost without stopping. His fingertips bled, the skin peeled away in small patches, yet he refused to quit. Every note became a way for him to say things he had never dared to speak, about family, about poverty, and about vague dreams he was even afraid to name. Music was not about fame back then. It was simply the only place where Alan did not feel trapped. Just 1 year later, he stepped onto a stage for the first time, performing in his high school's production of Oklahoma. It was not a grand stage, but that moment felt like a quiet prophecy for the long road ahead, a road he could not yet see, but had already begun walking without realizing it. After leaving school, life pulled him straight back into reality. Alan took on every kind of manual labor job he could find just to survive. Money was still scarce, the future still uncertain, but one thing never left him: music. He formed a small band called Dixie Steel and traveled from one local club to another. On those nights, they carried their own equipment, set up their own stages, and played for half-empty rooms, often leaving without earning a single dollar. Strangely enough, Alan never felt his time was wasted, because every time he lifted his voice, he felt more certain of one truth: this was where he belonged. And then, in the middle of those poor, seemingly unchanging days, Alan's life suddenly turned in another direction: love. The first time Alan saw Denise was in the parking lot of Noonan High School. She had blonde hair neatly tied back, bright eyes, and a gentle smile that looked like sunlight touching the pavement. Alan was 16 at the time, struggling with an old car that refused to start. Denise walked by, stopped, and softly asked, "Car trouble again?" It was a simple question, yet somehow it opened an entirely new chapter of his life. They started talking, then talking more, until one evening, sitting on a front porch under pale yellow light, Alan picked up his guitar and sang for Denise. Not to impress her, just a simple, honest song, as unpolished as he was himself. When the music faded, Denise looked at him for a long moment, smiled, and said something that left him speechless. "You have to chase music, Alan. You were born to sing." That sentence was the first time anyone had ever believed in him so completely. It lit a flame of faith inside him that he had never dared to hold on to, that the dream was not foolish, and that he had the right to step onto a stage. They loved each other in a very different way. No fancy restaurants, no brightly lit movie theaters, just long drives along dirt roads outside of town, the sound of a guitar filling the car, and two young people quietly dreaming of a day when they might escape the poverty closing in around them. In 1979, Denise agreed to become Alan's wife. They married with a borrowed ring. In a wedding so simple there was nothing to show off except the way they looked at each other and the quiet promise that no matter where life took them, they would walk it together. In 1985, at the age of 27, encouraged by his wife, Alan Jackson made the boldest decision of his life. Leaving Georgia and heading to Nashville, the holy land of country music, but also the graveyard of thousands of dreams that never lived long enough to come true. They loaded their entire lives onto an old, battered trailer. A single guitar, a few shirts worn thin at the shoulders, and a faith so fragile it seemed a slightly stronger gust of wind could blow it away. And yet, strangely enough, That very faith was stubborn in an almost defiant way, exactly like Alan himself. Nashville welcomed them with a cold, indifferent silence. No job, no connections, no one who knew who they were. The young couple huddled inside a cramped apartment so small that every sound echoed, constantly reminding them how far they were from home. To make rent, Denise worked herself to exhaustion, taking back-to-back shifts, moving in and out of airports like a clock that was never allowed to stop. As for Alan, he accepted any work the city was willing to throw at him, selling rusted cars, hauling heavy stacks of lumber. Hands that had already been calloused by a poor childhood grew even tougher, layer by layer, as if fate wanted to make sure he never forgot where he came from. At night, when the city finally fell asleep, Alan sat in that narrow room and wrote songs. He sent out demo tape after demo tape and received cold rejection letters in return, one after another, all eerily identical. They told him he should try something else. The most painful part was this: even Alan himself did not know what that something else was supposed to be. Just to survive, he took a side job in the mailroom of the Nashville network. Every day, Alan quietly sorted letters, addressed to country music stars, names printed in gold ink, people who were already living the dream he was still wearing himself down trying to reach. Some afternoons, after finishing his work, he would stare at the envelopes for a long time, as if asking himself a silent question. When would the name Alan Jackson appear here? And then, the breakthrough did not come from Alan's persistence. It came from the courage of love. On a flight, Denise, that small, unassuming wife, gathered every ounce of courage she had and walked up to Glenn Campbell, the country music legend seated just a few rows away. She did not speak about herself. She spoke about her husband, about his songs, his sleepless nights, and about a man whose faith was slowly running out, yet who still refused to let go of his guitar. Before leaving, Denise asked for just one small thing. Please, listen to his music. Glenn Campbell listened. He made no promises, offered no guarantees. He simply handed her his manager's business card. But that small piece of paper was worth more than any amount of money Alan had ever earned, because for the first time, a door had cracked open for their dream. Through that connection, Alan began writing songs for others. The pay was modest, but every time he heard someone else sing his lyrics, he knew one thing for certain: he was not lost. Music was still where he belonged. Then something no one dared to believe actually happened. In 1989, after 4 years of barely surviving in Nashville, Alan Jackson officially signed a contract with Arista Nashville, becoming the label's very first artist. When he heard the news, Alan broke down in tears like a child. He held Denise tightly and whispered, "Thank God for one more day." But the dream had barely begun before it was doused with cold water. On the very day of the release, the record company bluntly told him, "Don't expect too much." They believed his plain traditional sound was outdated, and they were not wrong. His debut single failed badly, almost completely ignored. In 1990, Alan wrote, "Here in the Real World." To listeners, it was simply a beautiful, melancholy country song. But to Alan Jackson, it was the final gamble of a man with no road left behind him. If this song failed, he would likely have to leave Nashville in silence. Then, in 1992, Chattahoochee was released, and America suddenly remembered where it came from. The song swept the charts, sold more than 6 million copies, and earned the most prestigious CMA award. From an unknown struggler, Alan Jackson became a name Nashville could no longer ignore. But just as he finally found his footing, the industry shifted direction again. Nashville wanted country music that was shinier, cleaner, easier to sell. Behind closed doors, executives mocked him. "Alan, you're too country. This style isn't in fashion anymore." They wanted him to abandon his Southern storytelling voice, a voice born from hunger, from cold nights, from an old garage and years of going without. They wanted him to become a safer, more commercial version of himself, someone Alan no longer recognized when he looked in the mirror. And for one of the rare times in his life, the quiet man pushed back. Slowly but firmly, he said, "I just want to make music that sounds like where I come from." That sentence stunned Nashville into silence. People advised him to compromise, to be smart, to hold on to what he already had. But Alan shook his head and replied, "Never. I'd rather die." That stubbornness came at a cost. In 1994, Alan Jackson severed ties with his management team, willingly walking away from $3 million, every cent he had saved during his hardest years. Nashville buzzed with disbelief. A rising star stepping off a golden chair thousands of others would dream their entire lives to reach simply because he refused to trade away who he was. That night, in a quiet house, Alan looked at his wife and said softly, "I'd rather be broke than lose myself." And then, Who I Am was born. 4 singles climbed straight to #1. A thunderbolt strike against everyone who had claimed Alan's music no longer sold. But to him, it was never just a numerical victory. It was a quiet confirmation. He was still here, not erased, not bent, and not broken. Yet there are victories that bring no peace. On the night America trembled after the tragedy of September 11, Alan Jackson could not sleep. The house lay in darkness, no lights, no sound. He paced from room to room, as if searching for an answer no one could give him. In his chest, waves of fear, loss, and helplessness surged, heavy enough to suffocate him. Finally, he turned to Denise and said in despair, "I don't want to profit from anyone's pain, but I have to do something for all of us." The next morning, as the first sunlight slipped through the curtains, Alan suddenly woke with a jolt. A strange melody echoed in his mind. Not loud, not forceful, just a quiet call, like a whisper in his ear. Where were you when the world stopped turning? He sat up, placed his hands on the guitar, and the song simply poured out, almost complete, as if it had existed long before and was only waiting to be spoken. Years later, Alan would still choke up recalling it. "I didn't write that song. I was just chosen to bring it into the world." When the song first aired, all of America fell silent. It did not shout. It offered no slogans. It made no attempt to sound strong. It simply said what millions were unable to voice. In the nation's darkest days, Alan's voice became a place people could lean on like a gentle hand on the shoulder, not telling them to stand up right away, only whispering, "We are hurting, and that pain is real." The song earned a Grammy and 5 CMA awards, but its greatest reward never appeared on any brightly lit stage. It lived in handwritten letters sent from across America, from firefighters who had lost their comrades, from mothers who had lost their children, from families waiting for someone who would never return. They wrote, "Thank you for saying what we couldn't. No amount of money could buy that." And Alan Jackson became wealthy not because of fame, but because it is rare for an artist to remain so truthful that history itself and the shared pain of an entire nation must borrow his voice to be heard. But just as Alan reached the summit, a quiet crack began to form, not on stage, but inside his own home. He toured hundreds of nights every year. Meanwhile, Denise ate alone each evening in a cold kitchen. At first, it was just missed calls, then unanswered messages. Gradually, Alan began living in 2 separate worlds, one filled with stage lights and applause, and the other where a woman was quietly trying to hold a marriage together with silence. What the audience never saw was this: the more famous Alan became, the lonelier he grew. After each performance, before the makeup was even wiped away, he would sit quietly in front of the mirror, feeling as though he were playing the lead role in a life that had somehow slipped out of his hands without him noticing. And it was within that emptiness that the distance between them began to crack open. One day, Denise heard Alan call another woman's name while he was drunk. In that moment, she understood that their love had not died from a lack of feeling. It had died from a void too large, carved between two people by the demands of his career. Then, the worst happened. In 1998, after long, isolated nights in unfamiliar hotel rooms, Alan Jackson made an inexcusable mistake. He betrayed Denise. When the truth came out, Denise did not cry or scream. She simply looked straight into her husband's eyes and asked a single question that brought Alan to his knees. "Did you do it because you were lonely or because you no longer needed me?" In that instant, Alan Jackson's entire life shattered into pieces. The man who could stand before tens of thousands without fear could not breathe under the gaze of the woman who had believed in him without conditions. On the night Denise packed her things and left the house, neighbors said Alan's eyes looked like those of a man whose soul had just been ripped away. He admitted the betrayal, and then Denise walked out, leaving behind a silent Nashville, where a marriage once held up as a symbol now stood on the edge of collapse. Alan told his friends in despair, "I hurt the only person who ever believed in me without question. I have nothing left to sing about." But the one who suffered the deepest wound, Denise chose a path no one expected. She prayed not for Alan to come back, but for her own heart to be strong enough not to collapse under hatred. Then in 2001, after hundreds of handwritten letters from a broken husband, Denise returned, not to start over from the beginning, but to continue from the very place where they had fallen apart. Her Christmas gift to Alan left all of Nashville stunned. A 1955 Ford Thunderbird, the car they had once dreamed of owning during their poorest days of youth. When Alan saw it, he broke down in tears. Not because of the car, but because of what it represented, that they had passed through the worst thing a heart can do to another heart, and still found the courage to reach for the most beautiful thing a human being can give: forgiveness. "I forgive you." Alan and Denise did not return to what they once were. But between them, a different kind of love took shape. Quieter, deeper, and more real. A love forged from brokenness, from the choice to stay, and from the decision to hold hands, even when every reason in the world said they should let go. After all the turbulence of fame, after tasting both glory and loss, Alan Jackson entered a phase that very few artists ever dared to reach, a phase where he no longer sang to prove anything, but sang simply to preserve what he believed in. In 2006, while Nashville was busy chasing polished country pop hits, Alan, unexpectedly, released an album no one was waiting for, Precious Memories. It was not hit-driven music, nor was it made for radio or loud promotional campaigns. It was simply a collection of old hymns, humble, slow, and reverent melodies that once echoed through the poor house of his childhood. Precious Memories unexpectedly rose straight to #1 on the Billboard 200-something, almost unheard of for an unpromoted gospel album. Millions of people turned to it not because Alan Jackson was a star, but because they needed a place of spiritual shelter in an increasingly noisy world. Many listeners said they did not hear that album with their ears, they heard it with their memories. Because in that voice lived their parents, their old churches, and those quiet evenings before life became far more complicated. From that moment on, people realized something. Alan Jackson had never chased the times. He simply stood still and let the times rush past him. Beyond music, Alan gradually became a cultural symbol without ever intending to build an image. The cowboy hat he wore for decades at first, it was merely a way to hide a large scar on his forehead from a childhood accident. But over time, it became part of his body, as if without it, Alan was no longer himself. He shaped the brim of his Stetson to fit his face, never following trends. He once said that cowboy hats are not for everyone. They require a genuine connection to the land you come from. Not to look cool, but to remind you of who you are. The handcrafted leather boots, faded jeans, and rhinestone shirts all came together to create an image of Alan Jackson, not as a performer, but as a Southern man who had stepped straight out of real life and onto the stage. In the years that followed, Alan continued releasing albums at a steady pace, not aggressively, not in competition with the times. What I Do, Good Time, Freight Train, 30 Mile West, the Bluegrass album, Angels and Alcohol. Each project was not a reinvention, but a different slice of the same man. One who never wanted to abandon his essence. He even returned to bluegrass, the most deeply rooted genre of the South, at a time when very few mainstream artists dared to go against the current. Not out of nostalgia, but because Alan believed that a tree without roots will eventually be torn from the ground. By 2021, when modern country had nearly been submerged by pop, hip-hop, and EDM, Alan released Where Have You Gone? The album was not rebellious, not confrontational, not argumentative. It simply asked a quiet, sorrowful question: where has country music gone? The mournful fiddle, the slow steel guitar, the everyday storytelling lyrics, all of it sounded like a letter sent backward to Nashville 30 years earlier. Critics called it Alan Jackson's final quiet rebellion. No noise, no confrontation, just honesty. Alan once said, "I came to Nashville because I wanted to make real country music. I grew up with Conway Twitty, Charlie Pride, George Jones, and Merle Haggard. That's what I love. And that's still all I do." 30 years later, he has never changed that answer. More than 75 million records sold worldwide. Over 44 million in the United States alone. 35 #1 hits. A star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And an honored place in the Country Music Hall of Fame. But just when Alan believed he had endured enough of life's rises and falls, fate placed him before an even crueler trial, the cancer diagnosis of the woman he loved most. In 2010, Denise Jackson was diagnosed with cervical cancer. For the first time in his life, Alan Jackson truly learned what fear felt like. Not the fear of losing his career or watching the stage lights fade, but the most primal fear of all, the fear of losing the person lying right in front of him. When the doctor uttered the word cancer, Alan stood frozen for a long moment. No one spoke in the room. Then he turned to his manager and said softly, but clearly enough to close every plan ahead of them, "I'm not going anywhere. She needs me." From that day on, Nashville almost stopped seeing Alan Jackson. He withdrew from interviews, from stages, from the spotlight, quietly stepping away from the world he once stood at the center of, to remain inside a hospital room filled only with the smell of medicine, the steady beeping of heart monitors, and a woman fighting day by day for her life. The months of treatment stretched on endlessly. Each time Denise woke up after chemotherapy, the first face she saw was always Alan's, his head resting near the edge of the bed, his hand gripping hers as if letting go for even a second would cause everything to disappear. There were nights when the pain left Denise unable to lift her head, when the room fell silent after the nurse's footsteps faded away. And in that silence, Alan broke down not with the tears of a star, but of a man who had once lost his wife before and now could only beg not to lose her again. But what few people know is that it was Denise who held him up during his weakest moment. In the midst of pain that left her body exhausted, she looked at her husband and whispered a sentence that stopped him cold. "I'm not afraid of dying. What I'm afraid of is that you'll never forgive yourself." That sentence struck the deepest place inside Alan Jackson, the place where, for years, he had silently punished himself for the past. For the first time, the man who had stood unshaken before tens of thousands, fell to his knees beside the hospital bed, held his wife's hand, and prayed not for fame, not for his career, but simply for a little more time with the woman who had chosen to forgive him. Later on, many people thought that moment was merely good news about her condition. But for the Jackson family, it meant something far greater. It was a resurrection. Not only for Denise, but for a marriage that had once shattered, once collapsed, once seemed beyond saving. Inside that small hospital room, two people found each other again, not through new promises, but through something deeper. Final forgiveness and a love strong enough to no longer fear losing each other again. And it wasn't only Denise's cancer. Alan Jackson's life was hollowed out by other voids as well. Voids that money or fame could never fill. The loss of his father, and then the loss of his mother. In 2000, Daddy Gene passed away. The humble, quiet man, so quiet that the family had grown used to his silence, left this world in a way that perfectly reflected who he was. Without noise, without long final words. When Alan received the news, he returned to Georgia for the funeral, carrying a hollow feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't the kind of pain that makes you cry out loud. It was the feeling that a foundation in his life had just collapsed, slowly but deeply. His father had never taught his son through words, but through the life he lived mornings leaving home before dawn, hands stained with motor oil, and a back bent silently over old car hoods. Each time he placed a hand on his son's shoulder, he said only one short sentence. "Keep trying, son." Not as advice or explanation, but in the way Southern men often love quietly, steadfastly, without needing to be heard. After his father's passing, Alan barely spoke. But within that silence, a slow melody began to take shape, and Drive for Daddy Gene was born not as a song about death, but as a memory still warm with life. An old car, a country road, and the feeling of sitting beside a father you never quite hugged tightly enough, yet spent a lifetime wishing you could sit next to just a little longer. When Alan sang that song on stage, many people broke down not because the melody was sad, but because within every line, they saw the shadow of their own fathers. Then, years later, grief knocked once more. This time, it was his mother. Ruth, the woman who kept that poor house warm, passed away, leaving behind a void that stripped Alan of his last anchor. At his mother's funeral, the man who had used his voice to soothe millions of hearts could not sing a single note. His throat closed up, and for the first time, even music was powerless against his own loss. Because to Alan, his mother was not just the woman who gave him life. She was the one who planted faith into every meal, every evening, the one who held him when the house wasn't warm enough, the one who taught him that music was not meant for fame but to keep people kind. And Alan understood, if he couldn't sing at his mother's funeral, he would sing for her in another way. Precious Memories was born like a prayer not showy, not shaped by the market, but simply a collection of old hymns, melodies his mother used to hum softly in that small kitchen long ago. Alan recorded the album not as an artist producing a project, but as a son trying to hold on to his mother's voice before it faded into silence. After losing his father and then his mother, Alan Jackson changed. He no longer sang to prove who he was, but to keep those who had passed on alive in memory, in music, and in the hearts of those who remained. And perhaps from that moment on, Alan Jackson was no longer just a country singer. He became a guardian of memory for an entire generation. Today, Alan Jackson, at 67, is no longer the tall man who strode onto the stage with the solid, confident gait of his younger days. In its place are slow, cautious steps, as if the ground beneath him could slip away at any moment. Charcot-Marie tooth disease has quietly taken away what Alan Jackson once considered a given, the ability to stand firmly on his own two legs. It did not strike violently, did not knock him down all at once. It simply weakened his body day by day, as if time itself were slowly draining his strength. For someone who spent more than 3 decades under stage lights, this is more than illness. It is the experience of learning to slow down, to calculate every step, and to accept that in some performances, the hardest part is no longer singing, but standing until the final note. Because of this, Alan Jackson made the most painful decision of his artistic life: to stop long touring schedules. Not because he stopped loving the stage, but because his body no longer allowed him to live that life. In 2025, he officially closed his cross-country touring journey with a final performance in May. But that was not the final goodbye. Alan Jackson kept one thing for himself like a promise. On the 27th of June, 2026, in Nashville, he will step onto the stage one last time for a concert titled Last Call, One More for the Road, the finale. Not a tour, not a long journey. Just one night. One night to say goodbye in the place where everything began. Offstage, Alan Jackson lives a life very different from the image of a music legend. He has nearly disappeared from the media. No talk shows, no social media noise, no display of wealth. His life unfolds quietly. On a farm in Franklin, Tennessee, with wooden fences, wide fields, a few horses, and long afternoons with no schedule. Alan enjoys restoring classic cars. He can sit for hours in the garage, polishing old metal parts, with no music playing, no conversation, just the sound of the wind and the familiar smell of engine oil that brings him back to memories of his father. He goes fishing early in the morning, tends his garden, drinks coffee on the porch, and spends most of his time with Denise, the woman who stood beside him through betrayal, cancer, and now this incurable disease. Becoming a grandfather has brought him a very simple kind of joy. When he speaks about his grandchildren, his voice softens so different from the powerful baritone heard on stage. He says that at this age, he no longer needs more stages, only peaceful mornings. Time is no longer something he can afford to waste. Though he has not released a new album since Where Have You Gone in 2021, Alan says he still writes music not to release it, but to keep his soul from falling silent. He once said, "I may not be able to stand for long anymore, but the music is still there." The Alan Jackson of today is no longer a symbol of strength, but a symbol of courage in accepting weakness. A man who understands that some battles cannot be won, yet still chooses to move forward, slower, more unsteady, but more honest than ever before. And when the final stage lights fade in 2026, Alan Jackson will not leave in tragedy. He will leave the way he lived his entire life, quietly, kindly, and leaving behind songs strong enough to outlive the man himself. Because some artists sing to be remembered, but Alan Jackson, he sang so that others would not forget who they are. And perhaps that is his greatest legacy. Looking back at Alan Jackson's life, one can see that he did not merely pass through a brilliant career, but through an entire lifetime filled with trials. From a boy growing up in an old garage in Georgia, to a man who preserved the soul of country music in a glittering age, from glorious peaks to painful fractures, irreparable losses, and a quiet battle with a disease that turned every step into an act of endurance. But Alan's greatest legacy does not lie in awards or hit songs, but in authenticity. He sang as who he truly was and stood firm in that integrity until the very last note. If this story touched you, please, like as a gesture of tribute, share so more people can remember Alan Jackson, and subscribe to the channel to continue walking alongside the truest stories behind the stage lights.